Hello everyone, welcome once more to this course on urban political economy and sustainability. And this course is obviously, as you know, it's those of you, especially those of you who are taking the course, you've heard this talk with you before. This course is organized by Postcape project and also supported by STUE, which is a profiling area of Tampere University. And today, on the 2nd of November, which is the second to last open lecture that we have, but in this lecture we have Ville Kellokumpu from the University of Oulu, PhD researcher who is specializing in these urban and regional geographies. And the topic of the lecture is the violent abstractions of the urban from a depoliticized urbanism towards a political economy of space. And without further ado, I turn it over to Ville, so Ville, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mikko, and thank you for the invitation for this course. It's great to be here. And hopefully my voice, you can hear it in the back row too. Just say something if it feels like I'm too low on the volume. But let's go ahead. So, as Mikko briefly there introduced, I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Oulu at the Geography Research Unit, specifically in the regional policy and regional development research group there. And my kind of main topic of study in my PhD could kind of go under the category of geographies of depoliticization. And basically in my PhD I have studied kind of this urban politics and planning side, a little bit visionary planning and depoliticization and how that plays into it. Specifically, I've studied the Oulu City Centre Vision project in one of my PhD articles. Then I've also studied a little bit about the forest industry here in Finland and specifically the bioeconomy and its relationship to kind of depoliticization. Specifically in my second PhD article, and then also a little bit more on this kind of state-capital relations, especially regarding the forest industry and how this theme kind of plays with this kind of topic of depoliticization. And with Heikki Sirviö, we looked at this Kaipola paper mill shutdown specifically in my third PhD article on this topic. And since we have the Geography Days, or the annual meeting of geographers, to be official, I think that conference is in Tampere, conveniently beginning today, and there's this kind of a pre-event protest BAP event happening at Ravintola Telakka at 7 p.m. after this lecture. So if you are interested, please attend the pre-event. We are going to discuss a little bit about the Finnish university kind of property strategies and real estate strategies. They've been quite topical here in Tampere and also in Oulu as well. So if you are interested, please join there after the lecture. So the kind of basic structure, I guess, of this lecture, I think we can divide it to kind of three categories here. Maybe I will open a little bit of these kind of concepts that I bring up in this title about abstractions and how they kind of relate relate to thinking about the urban, and then depoliticization too, and then maybe briefly to conclude, I will kind of try to situate this to this kind of idea of the political economy of space. So to begin, I kind of took here as an example one kind of tweet by Fatim Diarra. I think she's in the city council in Helsinki, maybe even the chair of the city council, if I remember correctly. But this is kind of a tweet in relation to kind of regional politics in Finland, and this was her kind of response to this planned regional student loan compensation experiment that was directed towards northern and eastern Finland, and I think this kind of experiment is now going to go through, or there has been maybe a decision made on this by the coalition already that this will be kind of tried out. And if I would kind of briefly maybe translate this couple of tweets here. This government has systematically stomped the cities. First the health and social services reform, and now graduates are being driven out of the capital region that is already experiencing labor shortage. The capital region is indisputably the engine of the Finnish economy. Is it really so that Helsinki residents are expected to pay for this party? How can we fulfill our mission as the engine of the economy if the labor pool moves away? So I kind of took this as an example of the kind of sentiment that is often emblematic in this kind of talk about regional politics here in Finland, and this kind of urbanism, I should say. If you would maybe this kind of popular urbanism kind of it is like an imaginary that seeks to promote these kind of urban areas, spaces and places as the prime mover of the society and economy. And I guess the core issue with this type of kind of popular urbanism is that, or that I argue that it kind of deals with urban space as abstracted space in a certain sense, as a space that is severed from its material relationship to other spaces. And in a way, it kind of sees urban space as almost like a self-contained space and capable of self-reproduction in a certain sense. And of course, there's this idea of kind of like this political idea of parasitism also, that there is certain spaces are kind of mooching off other spaces, and this can of course be like inverted too, that there are kind of like popular sentiments also exactly the opposite version, that the cities and the urban spaces are kind of parasites on the actually productive regions or spaces of the kind of national economy. And I think that kind of the core argument that I aim to kind of advance in this lecture, I bring it out here right in the beginning, so maybe it kind of helps you to kind of orient around this, is that kind of neither this kind of form of urbanism or ruralism, which kind of seeks to define these urban and rural spaces as self-contained, is really analytically justifiable. And I think we should be kind of on the lookout for these type of kind of vicious abstractions, that they kind of hinder our ability to analyze this spatial development of the state or the regions kind of holistically, or different places. And this kind of view of abstracted space can also produce kind of depoliticization or kind of depoliticized spaces in a certain sense. So maybe we try to start from simple things then. well, what do I mean by this kind of vicious or violent abstraction? Maybe here we can begin from kind of two simple definitions of abstraction and reification. Well, taking it off right from Wikipedia, abstraction is a process or result of generalization, removal of properties, or distancing of ideas from objects. And then reification refers to the process or kind of the treatment of something abstract as a material or concrete thing, or in other terms, it's also described as kind of a fallacy of misplaced concreteness. So kind of, well, when we think about abstraction, it's kind of a natural, very natural mental process that we categorize and simplify stuff in order that we can kind of function in this world that is kind of filled with complex things and complexity in general. So kind of on its own, abstraction is, you cannot really say it's a kind of a social problem. But maybe when we put these two things together, we put abstraction and reification together, we get this kind of form of vicious abstraction that might start to kind of, how would I say, distort some of our kind of views about things or about the state of the reality that we inhabit. So I think maybe we could look at this vicious abstraction then as a process through which kind of a mental model, an idea, or a generalization is kind of falsely treated as if it were a concrete thing that exists in the world. And these kind of abstractions can also become kind of causally real, in the sense that people start acting as if the abstraction was real. Well, the kind of the prime example here would be like the economy that we can talk about, that we talk of the economy as kind of totality of kind of a sphere that has its own kind of like a, how should I say, maybe well, it's kind of through this process of reification, it is made into an object that then people react upon, basically. And this is kind of like the social, or how I see the social and political power of abstraction, where it is kind of based, and this social and political power can also be expressed through these kind of abstractions. So maybe we can go a little bit, just briefly further into it. I think Alfredsson Rethel is quite a big kind of name in this regard, and his kind of idea of real abstraction too. And also this kind of Italian philosopher Enzo Pasi has this kind of nice quote about how kind of this capitalist society is kind of like the quintessential example of a society that is ruled by abstractions in a way. That the fundamental character of capitalism is revealed in the tendency to make abstract categories live as though they were concrete. So what is then this idea of real abstraction for Son Vel? Well, I guess the starting point maybe can be summed up here, that the starting point for this kind of real abstraction is the practice of commodity exchange, in which kind of value as abstraction constitutes the social praxis that makes otherwise incommensurable commodities exchangeable. referring here to Elena Louisa Lang's article, and it's kind of one in his view, one of the defining features of capitalist society, of how this kind of social praxis of exchanging commodities is premised on this abstraction, where kind of these different commodities with wildly different attributes and use values, they can be kind of measured against one another and made commensurate through the kind of metric of economic value, and the kind of the economic value, or value in this case, is kind of like the real abstraction that is working there. So money, by virtue of abstracted power as the universal equivalent, the negation of use value per se, becomes the direct manifestation of a society that cannot but express itself through abstraction as the predominant mode of social intercourse. Well, what is the social problem with real abstraction? Then maybe I briefly touched upon it when I tried to kind of sum up my core argument here, but it's kind of a process of masking in a certain sense. And for Son Rethel and others who have kind of dealt with this phenomenon of real abstraction, the kind of this is kind of like one of the core things there, the kind of the social relations of production and kind of the social relations that we have with one another, they become obfuscated through this kind of abstraction. We fail to see behind the mask of abstraction, and we treat these kind of abstractions like economic values as if they were kind of attributes of the commodities themselves. This is basically the idea behind commodity fetishism, I think could be kind of summed up there. So this kind of process of real abstraction, it ingrains a certain social logic into our society in a certain sense. So kind of continuing with this example of value, this kind of these everyday mundane acts that we kind of exchange commodities, the kind of the social and the political power of value is kind of reproduced in those mundane acts. And these kind of mundane acts can, in a certain sense, they kind of reproduce an objective reality of economic value in capitalist society. And of course, the objective can there always be in quotation marks in a certain sense, that it's based on an abstraction, but it is perpetuated and is felt as a reality living in a capitalist society. And it starts, or is able to, in a certain sense, cover our social practices. And this kind of, there's a quotation from Werner Bonfeld there, kind of maybe nicely also drives this point home maybe a little bit. In capitalism, Marx argues the individuals are governed by the product of their own hands, and what appears thus as economic nature is in fact a socially constituted nature that belongs to definite social relations. Social reality is thus an objective appearance. The social individual vanishes in her own social world, only to reappear with a price tag by which she is governed. Yet this inversion of social subject into the economic object is her own work. Unity appears in the form of a movement of real economic abstractions that, endowed with an invisible force, govern over and prevail through the social individuals. In that sense, the kind of the social power of this real abstraction is both real and illusory at the same time. a bit of weirdly contradictory thing. Well, how do we then kind of bring this idea back to this topic of urbanism? I think one of the central questions here is whether the kind of forms of urbanism or thinking about the urban as a space or place, whether these forms kind of promote or how they kind of constitute a kind of a benevolent abstraction that kind of justifiably helps us to focus on a specific scale or area, and it doesn't then hinder our ability to see larger changes in rural-urban relations? Or does it become a malevolent abstraction that kind of reifies this the urban or urban space as kind of a self-contained space, and then it kind of hinders our ability to see the kind of spatial connections to the other non-urban spaces and how the urban is constituted by the non-urban, to put it that way. And I guess this is not very easy to answer, or not very easy to clear or draw a clear demarcation line there. When do we kind of tip over to a malevolent abstraction from a benevolent one? And I guess here the scale might often tip towards this kind of a malevolent abstraction when we treat the urban kind of in a vacuum. It's divorced from these kind of concrete material transfers of natural resources and commodities between the rural and urban. We can look at kind of forestry, mining, agriculture, refining, industry, etc., etc. We look at or fail to look at the kind of transfers of economic value or capital flows between these rural and urban spaces. And then also maybe fail to see the kind of political relations between the urban and the rural as kind of a result of this. So that was basically the kind of my outline on this abstraction part, and now I try to a little bit kind of open my reasoning behind this depoliticization, or how I have approached it. So how do these kind of forms of urbanism become depoliticized then? Well, let's try to start with the basic stuff here. Try to establish what this phenomenon of depoliticization is. Kind of the abstract core of it, if you want to look at it from this way, is basically the transformation of political things into non-political things. That's kind of like the core, abstract core there. Well, it doesn't really tell you that much when you formulate it that way. Of course, then the next question is, what are these political things and what are these non-political things? And this is, of course, defining what politics is, or what the political is notoriously hard business. So maybe we try to kind of start from somewhere, as I say. You could think of it this way, basically, that the premise kind of which depoliticization rests is the division of labor between different societal spheres in the social world. So there we have to have this kind of have some kind of conception of different societal spheres or regions, or kind of social regions of different activity, in order for for this kind of a process of depoliticization, or the idea of it to work, that there exists a distinct sphere of social activity which is politics, and it is different from other spheres. And maybe we can kind of begin from this kind of separation and differentiation of these spheres in the social world. This might be the starting point. And here we can maybe try to venture a little bit into kind of systems theory territory, because this kind of perspective by Luhmann, or reported by this kind of systems theory, kind of looks at this differentiation of societal spheres, or kind of social subsystems from one perspective. So basically it kind of sees society through the lens of evolutionary development, where this kind of differentiated functional subsystems, they develop to respond to the complexity of the outside world. So we have these kind of social subsystems like the economy and the politics and the media, and they have their own kind of social logics, and they kind of respond to different things in the world, and they have a kind of a functional logic to them. And of course they kind of always aim to reproduce themselves. If you want to look at it from this kind of systems theory kind of background, then the politics can be kind of thought of as a social subsystem which has its own kind of functional logic, and politics kind of governs decision making, collectively binding decisions in a complex human society. Something like this could be a rudimentary definition of politics from this kind of systems theory perspective. And then depoliticization is kind of the process of boundary making between the political subsystem and the other subsystems, in a certain sense. But there is, of course, the issue here that this kind of systems theory has not been able to take into account the kind of specific historical epoch that we kind of inhabit, which is defined by capitalist social relations and the capitalist mode of production and social reproduction. Or some people might argue that it hasn't been able to take into account it very well. And kind of Popieso posits that Luhmann basically kind of denies any kind of dominance of a specific subsystem, believing that he views them all kind of as equally important, and then kind of as a result of this denies the primacy of class relations in a certain sense. Whereas then from this kind of Jesop's point of view, this kind of Marxian social theory has always been concerned, or has concerned itself in analyzing how the specific subsystem, the economy, rises to a certain kind of dominant position in these conditions. So Jesop basically posits that subsystems can gain kind of an ecologically dominant position, and that the economic subsystem has become like the ecologically dominant one in this case. So from maybe continuing it from here, we can kind of emphasize the kind of boundary making between the economy and politics as the primary, not of course the exclusive arena, but maybe one of the kind of dominant or primary arenas of depoliticization in these conditions. And one of the kind of key issues here is kind of the allocation of kind of political functions between the privatized economy and the political state. Basically here, citing Ellen Machin's Wood, speak of the differentiation of the economic sphere in this sense is not, of course, to suggest that the political dimension is somehow extraneous to capitalist relations of production. In all these senses, despite their differentiation, the economic sphere rests firmly on the political. The differentiation of the economic and the political in capitalism is more precisely a differentiation of political functions themselves and their separate allocation to the private economic sphere and the public sphere of the state. So depoliticization kind of coincides with the constant renegotiation of the boundaries of the political and the economic sphere. So how could you kind of attempt to define it? Well, there's a couple of quite influential definitions that people tend to float around regarding depoliticization, and one is from Burnham. Depoliticization as a governing strategy is the process of placing at one remove the political character of decision making. Another one by Flinders and Buller. The range of tools, mechanisms, and institutions through which politicians can attempt to an indirect governing relation and or seek to persuade the demos that they can no longer be reasonably held responsible for a certain issue, policy field, or specific decision. It might be missing a word there from there in between. And here maybe a third one from Juho Lukkonen and Heikki Sirviö. Depoliticization does not mark the end or pause of politics, but rather the removal of politics to other arenas and the redefinition or delimitation of the scope of participants, relevant topics, and vocabulary of politics. So there's a couple of ways that you can define it. Well, I kind of also attempted to give some kind of preliminary definition in my doctoral thesis that is still under work, but progressing quite nicely, which is kind of long and maybe needlessly complicated, but it kind of reflects maybe the themes that or tries to kind of combine the different themes that I bring up in the doctoral thesis. So depoliticization is based materially on the complex differentiation and separation of politics from other societal spheres. It arises as a causal material force in the world when this differentiation is reified and reproduced in social practice. Manifests itself dominantly but not exclusively through the demarcation of politics and economics in the context of capitalist social relations, appears either as an internal or external delimitation of the operational autonomy of the political sphere, and seeks to primarily secure the reproduction of the economy as the ecologically dominant societal sphere, and is perpetuated through modes that set favorable conditions for capital accumulation and the continuation of capitalist social relations. Well, that was a long and needlessly complicated definition, but maybe we can bring this kind of level of abstract thought down a little bit to the concrete by looking at this maybe empirically a little bit. So as I kind of alluded to in the beginning, that in the first PhD article, I kind of analyzed the Oulu City Centre Vision 2040 project from this perspective of depoliticization, and maybe this can help open a little bit of these kind of these theoretical perspectives, how they kind of maybe unfold in the real world, so to say. And the kind of basic aim of this City Centre Vision project was to formulate the kind of overarching vision for the development of the city centre in Oulu. And the project lasted from December 2015 to April 2017, basically when the vision was ratified. by the city council, and it engaged a range of actors in the process, from kind of different from individual citizens, associations, corporate actors, political decision makers, etc., etc. So we can maybe view this city-centered vision as kind of a strategic consensus of the city's kind of a managerial fraction behind a certain vision, and in it we can kind of detect a shifting of the modes of visionary planning from the kind of political to the economic sphere in a certain sense. And the kind of main rationale of how I kind of interpret it is that this vision kind of aims at fine-tuning urban space to respond to the demands of globalized capital. And this is kind of done by increasing kind of flexibility and urban compaction, and then economic competitiveness in the city center of Oulu. So this kind of mode of depoliticization that is kind of present in this project is kind of like the economization of the questions and the issues relating to the urban in this case. A couple of quotes here. To strengthen the attractiveness of the city center, it is important to pursue urban space that attracts nationally and internationally strong commercial actors to Oulu. The sub-optimization of political decision makers and their inability to commit to the decisions of the last electoral term were seen as the root problems. Interviewees brought up a typical problem of decision making, active complainers whose particular interest collide with the public interest. So, kind of at its core, this kind of visionary planning project, it, in a certain sense, aims to be a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. It kind of aims to produce a vision of a stable and predictable urban market environment where capital can flow to, and to create kind of economic forecasts that then generate kind of expectations of future value creation, basically. And maybe from the quote earlier, you can kind of excavate also this idea that visionary planning is also kind of a method of changing the kind of temporal scale of urban politics beyond the scope of these kind of particular political scuffles, expressed here in this kind of second quotation there. I guess this kind of quote from Nikos Poulantzas kind of nicely emphasizes or kind of ties this point home in a certain sense, that here then lie the limits to capitalist planning, even when it takes the form of programming or establishment of broad production guidelines. It is not so much real planning as a projection into the future of the general tendencies prevailing at a given moment in time. So kind of the interesting part, I would say, about the city center vision project is that it's actually not very much or not at all actually concerned about the future. I feel like it is mostly concerned with with the present and like this projection into the future of the general tendencies prevailing at that moment. We kind of try to create these visions that correspond or kind of give signals about this kind of stable environments where kind of investments or capital can flow into. And maybe like one other example from this project could be that it's kind of scant, or it doesn't really at all kind of deal with this kind of planetary ecological crisis that we have at the moment. It's kind of almost like a non-existent thing. But when you think about the scale, think about city centers in the year 2040. Well, if you had any kind of notion of this kind of scale of the kind of ecological crisis that we have, you would think that it would kind of also mean that we would need to respond to it and kind of formulate some vision that kind of responds to that scale of changes that is quite likely going to happen. But that's not really present in this project at all. So the kind of depoliticization that is kind of present or tried to kind of grapple with in this article is this kind of form of economization in a certain sense. That's I think the core issue there. So to kind of conclude, our imaginaries of the urban are could be argued they are sometimes or even often based on conceptions that are kind of these abstractions, like I went through in the first phase, or how they are kind of depoliticized or subject to this kind of depoliticization in the kind of second part that I went through there. And this kind of manifests itself through this kind of idea, or the way that we deal with the urban as space that is kind of severed from its surroundings in a certain sense, and the kind of how the kind of arenas of urban politics are becoming increasingly economized. So here I kind of try to maybe present a few ways of going forward, or how do we kind of prevent maybe like these vicious abstractions or these kind of depoliticizations when we think about the urban or urban space. Well, you can kind of try to ground yourself in material things to try to kind of see these connections. It's kind of flows of matter and resources. Of course, when you look at what happens in urban space, the kind of very concrete things, or you could think about concretely, meaning the thing that you build house from. Where does it come from? Where does the matter that you kind of is around you, where does it come from, and what kind of flows or chains it has to different spaces? Well, wood, concrete, food, etc., etc. There are many things you can look at from there. Then you can try to look at these kind of flows of capital and economic value, how they kind of first circulate in the national economy and maybe the local scale, regional scale in the national economy, and of course we are not ever severed from the global economy either. So we can look at kind of chains of value chains, kind of movements from kind of primary production, primary economy to secondary and then tertiary economy. These are, the service economy is not a non-material economy either. It's a very material economy. Or then you can look at infrastructure or the formation of fixed capital in different places, how kind of patterns of these kind of regional investment or disinvestment kind of unfold in space. And these, of course, they all kind of produce this kind of functional totality in which the urban is only one part of in a certain sense. And I guess these might be one of the ways of trying to proceed with this one. Of course, there are many others I would argue probably worth emphasizing here, but probably my economic reductionist mind could not think of other matters than these ones when making these slides. But of course, kind of the role of kind of culture and these kinds of things might be too kind of a key aspect there. But I guess I have probably kind of summarized these ideas that I tried to put forth in this kind of lecture, and I hope I was concrete enough and you kind of understood the point I was going with here, and I hope that this was somehow thought-provoking or you gain some kind of value out of this lecture. But that's the kind of basic gist that I was going with this kind of core argument in this lecture. So at the moment I do not have anything to add, so thank you all, and hopefully, and there seems to be quite a lot of time for discussion too, so maybe we can discuss these themes and you have some kind of questions too. So thank you.